A Tuesday morning in the mountains was supposed to be quiet, almost sacred, the kind where the air itself feels like it has been rinsed clean overnight, sharp and cold enough to make every breath a reminder that you're alive. I had coffee steaming in my hand, watching sunlight spill like golden paint across pine branches, when the hum of machinery cut through the stillness like a predator's growl. At first I thought it was logging equipment passing on the far side of the valley, but the rumble kept coming closer, straight up my private road, a road only locals used and usually not before breakfast. I set my mug on the railing and walked around the side of the house. That's when the view shifted from ordinary to surreal. 3 heavy trucks, diesel fumes staining the crisp mountain air, climbing steadily toward me. Behind them, a flatbed trailer hauling a bulldozer big enough to plow through a barn. Men in hard hats and reflective vests piled out the moment the lead truck stopped, moving with the tired but professional precision of workers convinced this was just another contract job. Their foreman, clipboard under one arm, marched toward me with the overconfidence of a man who'd never been challenged on a worksite. "Sir, you need to evacuate immediately," he barked, already flipping through papers. "This property has been deemed an imminent fire hazard. We have an emergency demolition order for this structure under federal authority." He shoved the paperwork toward me, and at a glance it carried the trappings of legitimacy: letterhead, signatures, an official seal. But details matter. I'd worked in government too long to miss them. The seal's edges were pixelated, cheap print job quality. The typography mismatched. Even the paper stock was wrong. Actual state or federal documents carry the weight of vellum. This was recycled copy paper dressed like a wolf in polyester fleece. In short, a fake. I flipped the page back to him. "Interesting," I said slowly. "Regional Fire Safety Authority, huh? That's odd. I should know every fire agency in this state." He stiffened, waiting for the punchline. "Probably because I do. I'm the governor, and that agency doesn't exist." For a moment, silence sank over the group like snow on dry branches. A younger worker dropped his hard hat, the clatter echoing against steel. Eyes widened like kids caught sneaking cookies before dinner. But the foreman, credit where it's due, doubled down. He lifted his chin, mustache twitching, insisting with the desperation of someone realizing mid-performance that the stage is collapsing beneath him. "Regardless of who you claim to be, my crew was hired under contract out of state. These documents authorize us to proceed. We've been instructed this structure is unsafe. We have 15 minutes before we start the teardown. 15 minutes to erase the place I had built with my hands after burying my mother, brick by brick, nail by nail. 15 minutes to burn down the sanctity of mornings where her old rocking chair still faced the eastern sunrise. And they were arrogant enough to deliver it like an administrative detail, as if I should thank them for the courtesy. What struck me wasn't just the fraud. It was the orchestration. These men hadn't arrived by mistake, hadn't chosen my house at random. Someone had recruited them, forged these documents, and sent them to destroy this home, my home, under the banner of fake authority. It wasn't sloppy neighbor harassment anymore. It was targeted demolition with a fraudulent government mask. The foreman's phone rang. His eyes flicked nervously at the screen before he answered. A woman's voice crackled so loud I could hear the tone, if not the words. Sharp, commanding, unyielding. "Keep going." That was all I caught. He hung up, forced a smile that was more steel than kindness, and delivered his ultimatum again. "You have 15 minutes to remove personal items. After that, we proceed." That's when clarity settled cold in my stomach. They were impersonating federal officials, which wasn't just unethical. It was felony territory. Organized fraud. Impersonation of government agency. Conspiracy to destroy private property. So I did the only thing to cut through illusions. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "This is Governor Nick Hale. I am documenting what appears to be a criminal conspiracy to demolish my private residence using fraudulent government authority." I panned slowly across the bulldozer, the workers, the forged paperwork in my hand, settling finally on the foreman's paling face. "The Regional Fire Safety Authority cited here does not exist. These men are impersonating officials to commit property destruction." The crew shifted uncomfortably. One man stepped back from the bulldozer like it had grown radioactive. Another muttered under his breath, side-eyeing the foreman. The mountain breeze seemed to have teeth now, biting through their reflective vests, pulling sweat out from under their helmets. I dialed directly to my state police contact. "Sheriff, this is Governor Hale. I need immediate units to my private residence. Individuals are impersonating officials with fraudulent demolition orders. Arrests required. Even as I spoke, Mrs. Thompson's Honda Civic screeched up the gravel. She parked skewed half across the truck convoy, jumped out. All 4 feet, 11 inches of Swiss Army knife determination. Phone in her hand, filming too. "What in God's name are you men doing?" she demanded, marching straight at the foreman. "This is the governor's house. And even if it wasn't, you can't just roll up with a bulldozer and lies." She snapped their fake documents from his hand, glanced once and barked, "Garbage. No such agency exists." Neighbors began arriving, phones aloft, recording every angle, weaving a digital net that would become evidence none of these men could outrun. What had begun as an intimidation ploy was morphing into a scene of exposure. The foreman raised his phone again, knuckles white, whispering in panic to his handler. But this time the crew's nerves had already cracked. Like dominoes toppling, men shoved papers back in trucks, unhooked chains from bulldozers, retreating step by step. And in that moment, standing on my porch with coffee cooling beside me, I understood. This wasn't the end. This was just the opening salvo in a much bigger war, and whoever thought fake authority could erase my home had chosen the wrong mountain and the wrong man. By the time the sheriff's deputies cleared out the trucks and the demolition crew slunk back down the mountain road with their bulldozer chained to a flatbed, the valley had turned into a hornet's nest. Word moves with wildfire speed in rural communities, especially when Mrs. Thompson is at the center of it. By late afternoon, everyone within 5 miles knew that a fake regional fire safety authority had tried to tear down the governor's house. Nobody believed it was random. And by nightfall, an emergency HOA board meeting had been called. On paper, it was about community clarification. In reality, it was about Valerie Pierce. The parking lot of the community center looked like the site of a high school football championship. Cars lined both shoulders of the access road for nearly a quarter mile. Headlights flickering as neighbors hurried toward the meeting like jurors summoned for a verdict they already knew was coming. The hum of voices carried a sharpness, a readiness for confrontation. Inside, the setup had abandoned the usual polite trappings of HOA gatherings. Coffee machines, stacks of agendas, a lukewarm flag in the corner, and replaced them with something closer to a courtroom, folding chairs arranged in strict rows. The board members sitting stiffly at the long table in front, each one wearing expressions that hovered between defensive and terrified. And at the table's center, presiding like a queen trying to maintain her throne, sat Valerie Pierce. Valerie was exactly the image of rehearsed authority. Silver hair pulled into an unforgiving bun, navy blazer decades past its prime, lips holding that politician's curve of a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She gavelled the room to silence with forced cheerfulness. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know there's been some confusion about today's enforcement action, and I want to address those concerns directly." Confusion. That was her choice of word, as if ordering a bulldozer crew under fake federal papers to demolish the governor's house was the organizational equivalent of misplacing a stapler. I stood immediately, phone in hand, before she could continue her script. "Valerie, let's skip the pleasantries. You sent a demolition crew to my property this morning with fraudulent documents. You invoked an agency that doesn't exist. And I have a recording of your voice telling the foreman to finish the job or you don't get paid." The room stirred like a pack of restless hounds. Dozens of phones rose to record, screens glowing, archiving every breath. Some neighbors gasped, others murmured curses under their breath. Across the board table, Marcus Webb, the attorney, looked like gravity had doubled on his shoulders. Valerie clutched her gavel tighter, eyes sweeping the crowd like she could intimidate them back into submission. "Governor Hale, you are out of order. This is an HOA meeting, not some courtroom. We followed proper procedures under emergency fire hazard abatement. The paperwork was provided by legal counsel." "Your legal counsel?" I asked, turning toward Marcus. "Marcus, did you review the demolition documents before authorizing this action?" Sweat gleamed on his temples under the brittle fluorescent lights. He fiddled with his glasses, searching for a dignified answer. "Governor, I reviewed what appeared to be federally sanctioned protocols provided to me by President Pierce. We believe the authority was legitimate." "Yes," I snapped, "an authority that doesn't exist, and you knew better." Marcus's voice faded to nothing. A smart lawyer knows when silence is safer than speech. The crowd erupted in furious voices. "Show us the law," shouted someone from the back row. Another slammed their palm on the board table so hard a styrofoam coffee cup toppled, scattering lukewarm liquid across the stack of agendas. Valerie tried to shout over them, but her voice cracked, panic bleeding through the rehearsal polish. Mrs. Thompson rose from the row behind me, small but fierce, her voice cutting across the chaos like a whip. "Valerie Pierce, I've lived in this valley for 60 years. My husband chaired this board for 15 of them. Not once did this association authorize demolition of a neighbor's home, emergency or otherwise. What you pulled today was criminal, plain and simple, and everyone in this room knows it." Dozens of heads nodded, voices sharpening into testimonies. One man shouted, "They threatened to tear down my fence when it was 6 inches too tall." Another woman rose, trembling with anger. "Valerie herself came to my garden and said if I didn't remove non-compliant plants in 7 days, she would send contractors and bill me." The pattern spilled into daylight. Escalating intimidation, arbitrary fines, threats of emergency enforcement. Today's bulldozer wasn't an accident. It was the climax of a campaign Valerie had been running for months. Valerie banged the gavel again, her face crimson, but this time the wood slipped from her shaking hand. The smacking sound against the linoleum floor was less authority and more defeat. I walked closer to the front, holding up my phone. "For the record, this is your voice, Valerie, instructing the demolition crew to proceed even after being told the agency didn't exist. You specifically said, 'Finish the job or you don't get paid.'" The room fell into suffocating silence. The recording played aloud, her voice undeniable. Board members stared as though seeing her for the first time, realizing this wasn't tough leadership but calculated fraud. Even her longtime allies shifted their chairs away, distancing themselves as if her guilt might be contagious. Finally, Mr. Peterson, a gray-haired board veteran, rose from his seat at the table. His voice trembled but carried backbone authority. "According to our bylaws, we can call an emergency vote of no confidence. I'm doing so now, effective immediately. All in favor of removing Valerie Pierce from her position as HOA president? Raise your hands." Hands rose like a tidal swell. Unanimous. Even Marcus, drowning in sweat, raised his timidly, sealing her fate. Valerie shoved papers into her briefcase, face a mix of fury and humiliation. "You can't do this. You'll regret this. This isn't over." But it was. For the first time in years, the community had called her bluff with real authority. Law, evidence, witnesses, and she had nothing left but empty threats. The same woman who once weaponized fear against her neighbors now staggered toward the exit, drowned by the evidence of her own voice. That night, the valley felt lighter. But everyone knew this wasn't truly finished. HOA bullying might unravel here, but fraud with interstate fingerprints didn't fade with a single vote. Valerie's war had escalated into a crime, and crimes summon consequences far larger than she could control. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting, the mountain air carried a strange weight, like the forest itself knew the balance had tipped. Valerie Pierce had stormed out of the community center with her blazer clutched like armor, but everyone in that room had seen the cracks. The recordings were public, neighbors had sworn testimonies ready, and the board had stripped her of her title in real time. Yet the danger hadn't passed. Organized fraud isn't undone just because angry neighbors recorded a meeting. It requires law enforcement with handcuffs and warrants, and that's exactly what the county prosecutor decided to initiate the very next day. At dawn, I stood on my deck sipping coffee, staring at the house that had nearly been turned to rubble by a fake demolition crew, when Sheriff Tom Williams pulled into my drive in a county SUV. The look on his face carried the kind of focused gravity I'd only seen in war rooms and courtrooms. "Governor," he said, "we have enough evidence for criminal, warrants, fraud, impersonation of government officials, conspiracy. We'll be executing simultaneous arrests on Valerie and Marcus Webb before they can coordinate their stories." In simple terms, it was finally time the people who thought fake letterhead could topple a governor learned what real law looks like. Watching law enforcement roll toward Valerie's perfectly manicured ranch-style home carried its own irony. She'd terrorized half the valley over mailbox heights and garden colors while building a criminal enterprise out of her living room. Deputies approached cautiously, surrounding the property. Sheriff Williams knocked on the door with a voice like a hammer. "Valerie Pierce, this is the county sheriff. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands visible." At first, nothing stirred. Then came the unmistakable whine of a paper shredder grinding desperately from behind the curtains. It was the frantic soundtrack of guilt. Valerie was destroying evidence with the kind of fury only panic produces. The deputies pushed harder. "Miss Pierce, shredding documents won't save you. You're under arrest for impersonation of government officials, criminal fraud, and obstruction of justice. Step outside now." The grinding stopped mid-sheet. Moments later, the deadbolt turned slowly. Valerie appeared in her bathrobe, hair undone, paper cuts running across her hands. She stumbled into the doorway with wild eyes, muttering about harassment and misunderstanding. But nobody was buying the performance anymore. She was cuffed on her front porch while stunned neighbors filmed from across the street. Across town, another team of deputies executed the warrant on Marcus Webb. Unlike Valerie, the local attorney didn't try to keep up appearances. Instead, he was caught tossing files into a steel barrel behind his office, fire already crackling, burning evidence in plain sight while the warrant was read. Nothing screams guilt like midnight bonfires of client paperwork. Deputies had to douse the flames before carting off partially charred documents that still contained incriminating contracts, emails, and notes. Marcus looked less like an attorney and more like a rogue accountant whose hands couldn't stop shaking. By noon, both were in county custody, facing booking photographs and charges that rattled louder than any gavel. But here's where their paths diverged. Valerie clung to denial like a shield, insisting she'd been protecting community safety. Marcus, however, was an attorney with enough survival instinct to know a sinking ship when he saw one. He cracked. That afternoon, in a suffocatingly bright interview room, he waived his right to counsel and began spilling every detail of what Valerie had orchestrated. His voice trembled, hands shaking as he slid boxes of files across the table. "She approached me with what she claimed were new federal emergency regulations," he admitted. She said the Regional Fire Safety Authority was a new agency, formed after the California wildfires, and that we needed to help HOAs implement emergency procedures. He described Valerie handing him binders stuffed with fake seals, fabricated organizational charts, bogus federal memos, the works. She had presented everything as urgent, time-sensitive, insisting the community was in danger of catastrophic fire hazards unless swift demolition orders were issued. Marcus admitted he should have verified everything independently, but instead he drafted the legal templates she wanted, stamping them with manufactured authority. It was damning, but Marcus wasn't finished. He went a step further, providing his laptop to investigators. On it lay spreadsheets documenting payments, kickbacks, and assessments totaling hundreds of thousands. "She called it consulting," Marcus explained, voice cracking with each word. "But it was fraud disguised as HOA enforcement. I was complicit, and I'll testify to everything if it helps reduce my sentence." He even turned over recorded phone conversations with Valerie, her crisp voice on the line instructing demolition crews to intimidate homeowners and push through emergency abatements. By evening, the county prosecutor held a press conference. Standing under the stone arch of the courthouse, Jennifer Alvarez announced charges that turned the Valley's HOA drama into national headline material: impersonation of federal authority, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit property destruction, obstruction of justice. She made it clear this wasn't some messy homeowner dispute. It was a criminal enterprise masquerading as neighborhood compliance. With Marcus's cooperation, prosecutors now had indisputable proof that Valerie hadn't acted carelessly. She had masterminded a network of fake authority, weaponizing fear of government to bulldoze homeowners into submission. That night, as the sun fell behind the ridges, the valley buzzed differently than it had in months. Neighbors weren't whispering about mailbox measurements anymore. They were parsing federal acronyms, RICO, fraud, conspiracy, and realizing that Valerie's intimidation wasn't just bullying. It was organized crime, and thanks to Marcus Webb's cracked conscience, the prosecutors now had the roadmap to dismantle it piece by piece. For me, standing on my porch looking at the home almost demolished under falsified orders, it was surreal. What had begun as a personal standoff with a bulldozer on my driveway was now morphing into a federal-scale prosecution, and the lesson was chillingly clear. HOA harassment may begin with petty rules, but in the wrong hands it can metastasize into a racket so criminal It takes the cuffs of law enforcement to finally stop it. Valerie had wanted control. Instead, she'd gained a cell. The courthouse was packed from wall to wall on the opening day of Valerie Pierce's trial. People squeezed into wooden benches like spectators at a high-stakes sporting event, except there would be no cheering here, only gasps and whispers as the scope of her crimes unfolded. Victims clutched folders of documents, attorneys laid out thick binders of evidence, and the media lined the back rows with cameras ready. Trial by law had finally replaced trial by rumor. I sat near the front, keenly aware of how this had all begun with bulldozers idling in my driveway. 8 weeks later, the attempt to destroy my house had detonated into a federal case alleging fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and more. Judge Morrison presided with the calm weight of someone who understood that this case was not just about one mountain HOA, it was about setting a precedent. He instructed the jury carefully, reminding them of neutrality while acknowledging the heavy charges. Prosecutor Martinez, the same woman who had gleamed with determination at pretrial hearings, opened briskly, her voice cutting like a knife through the hushed room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "you will hear evidence of one of the most systematic abuses of authority we have ever seen. The defendant didn't just commit fraud. She invented federal agencies to terrorize vulnerable families into compliance. She stole money, she stole homes, and in some cases she stole the very trust citizens have in legitimate authority." She paced slowly, letting the words land. "The evidence will leave you no doubt that Valerie Pierce masterminded a criminal enterprise." The prosecution's case unfolded piece by piece, methodical and devastating. First came the trove of fake documents, glossy letterhead, fabricated seals, official protocols typed with mismatched fonts. Experts took the stand to explain how none of the agencies Valerie cited, the so-called Regional Fire Safety Authority, the Environmental Emergency Abatement Council, existed in any database or state registry. Side-by-side comparisons were shown to jurors. Real seals on real state documents looked crisp and embossed. Valerie's were pixelated reproductions a high schooler could have faked. When asked point-blank under oath, state fire officials confirmed, "No such agency has ever existed in this state." Then came the voice recordings. The jurors stiffened as Valerie's own voice was played aloud, instructing contractors, "Finish the job or you don't get paid." Her tone, clipped and commanding, contrasted savagely with her current posture at the defense table, where she sat in a navy suit 2 sizes too large, lips pressed into a thin line. Watching her wince as her own words echoed back was a moment of raw justice. But the evidence that truly shifted the air in the room was human testimony. Victims took the stand one after another, each story a stab straight into the conscience of the jury. Mrs. Jennifer, now in her 80s, testified about the cabin she and her late husband had built with their own hands after returning from Vietnam service. Her voice trembled as she described standing helplessly while hired crews waved fake emergency notices and bulldozed 50 years of memories into dust. She dabbed her eyes but never broke. "They told me if I resisted, I'd face federal prosecution. I am an old woman. I was terrified, so I watched my home die before my eyes." More than one juror wiped away tears before the testimony ended. Next came David Martinez, a rancher from Texas who had been targeted with one of Valerie's water contamination cons. He testified in plain, quiet words. "They said my livestock were poisoning groundwater. They gave me 72 hours to pay nearly $20,000, or face demolition. My property isn't even near a major water line. Still, I sold a quarter of my herd just to keep the roof over my family's head." He bowed his head so the jury could see the toll in his weathered face. Then Mrs. Santos, who broke down completely as she recounted how Valerie's agents threatened her with fake immigration enforcement notices. Her grandchildren, she sobbed, still woke up at night convinced government men would take them away. The court fell into a silence so heavy even the judge put down his pen and listened. The cruelty was clear. Valerie had deliberately targeted the most vulnerable, elderly, immigrant, minority households, people least equipped to push back. For every page of fraudulent paper, there was a family in ruins. When Marcus Webb testified, the air froze with disbelief. The once composed lawyer appeared gaunt and twitching on the stand, but his words rang steady. "Yes, I helped draft the paperwork, but only under her instruction. She provided the templates, the binders of fake authority. I was complicit, but she orchestrated everything. He acknowledged his guilt, but made it clear Pierce was the architect. He identified phone records, contracts, emails, all pointing back to her office as ground zero of an enterprise. Jurors leaned forward as Webb described Valerie's pitch to HOA boards. Emergency action is federally mandated. Delay will cost you rebates and liability. Sign here. He confessed he had believed her once until evidence proved otherwise, and now, in humiliating irony, his testimony sealed her fate. Piece by piece, Martinez built a case far beyond negligence. Financial analysts followed, showing spreadsheets of millions funneled through shell accounts, deposits labeled consulting, withdrawals traced to kickbacks. Environmental experts testified to wetlands poisoned by unlicensed demolitions carried out under Valerie's fake orders. Each layer added weight until the burden of her guilt grew undeniable. The defense tried to argue Valerie acted in good faith, that she had believed sincerely in her own paperwork. But that argument crumbled the moment prosecutors displayed trophy photographs seized from her home office. Before and after shots of demolished homes, families crying, signatures obtained under fabricated threats. She had documented her crimes with obsessive pride, and now they were damning her in front of the world. By the end of the second week, the case felt less like prosecution and more like exposure of a predator. The jury had heard the victims, seen the fake authority documents, tracked the money, and watched an attorney testify against the very woman who claimed to value community order. The room understood. This was not HOA zealotry gone too far. It was organized. Deliberate, systematic crime. When the prosecution rested, Valerie's defense looked hollow, almost theatrical. Their arguments fluttered helplessly against the iron certainty of evidence. Everyone in that courtroom knew they were not witnessing a misunderstanding. They were watching the dismantling of a criminal empire built in their own backyards, and the streak of fear she had sown for years was finally being stripped tile by tile, revealing what it really was, a house of fraud. The day of sentencing felt heavier than the trial itself. The federal courthouse was overflowing, not just with reporters and attorneys, but with neighbors, families from across 4 states, and victims who had traveled hours to see justice given form. Some hobbled in on canes, others with folders of victim statements clutched tightly like shields. They weren't here to argue anymore. They were here to witness whether the system would finally protect them from the fake authority figures who had terrorized their lives. Valerie Pierce shuffled into the courtroom in her orange jumpsuit, the elegant composure she once carried as HOA president, long since burned away. Her hair was messy, her wrists cuffed, and her eyes darted around the room as if scanning for one last escape route. There wasn't one. Prosecutor Martinez wasted no time. Her sentencing recommendation was brutal, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. She laid out everything again: fraud, impersonating government officials, racketeering, obstruction, wire fraud, environmental crimes, and most damning of all, the deliberate targeting of elderly and immigrant families. She cited victim impact reports, numbers as cold as steel. Over $14 million in damages, 3 major watersheds contaminated, entire communities destabilized. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady. The defendant weaponized government fear against vulnerable citizens. She stripped homes from widows, forced ranchers into panic sales, and manipulated families with immigration threats. This wasn't negligence, it was cruelty organized into a business model. "We recommend maximum sentencing under RICO and civil rights statutes." Then came the voices of the victims. Mrs. Jennifer, frail but unbroken at 85, rose slowly with the help of her daughter. She spoke into the microphone with trembling hands. "Your Honor, my husband fought overseas for this country because we believed in its protections. Yet I had to stand on my porch and watch strangers tear down the home we built because a piece of paper told me it was the law. That paper was a lie, and that lie has haunted me every day since." The room went silent except for her quivering breaths. Next was David Martinez, his rancher's hat clutched tight in his weathered hands. "Judge, when you work the land for 50 years, it becomes your soul. Pierce's people threatened to take it away unless I paid money I didn't have. I had to sell my cattle, my pride, just to keep my land. I may never get back what she took from me, but I pray no one else ever deals with what we lived through." His voice cracked, but it carried through the oak-paneled courtroom with the weight of truth. Then Mrs. Santos, tears streaming as she described how fake immigration notices shattered her grandchildren's sense of safety. They still hide when someone in uniform comes near. They still think the government will come to take them away, because Pierce made them believe the law was their enemy. Her words hit harder than any financial record. This was not just fraud. This was trauma passed down like inheritance. Judge Morrison's face never wavered, but his eyes betrayed the toll of listening to hours of human wreckage. When Valerie's attorney begged for leniency, citing her age and lack of prior convictions, you could feel the futility. He argued she thought she was enforcing community standards. The judge held up the stack of photographs Pierce had kept, before and after shots of demolished homes, victims crying while bulldozers tore through their fields. "These were your trophies," Morrison said, his voice ablade. This was no misguided service. This was organized criminal enterprise. Then came the sentence delivered in grave authority that turned the room into stone. "Valerie Pierce, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years in federal prison under RICO and civil rights statutes. You are ordered to pay restitution of $12 million, forfeit all assets tied to criminal activity, and are permanently barred from involvement in any homeowners association or enforcement organization. You manipulated the trust of vulnerable people, poisoned communities, and attempted to cloak yourself in government power. That makes you not simply a fraud but a danger. Justice demands you spend the rest of your productive life behind bars." The room didn't cheer. It exhaled. A wave of sound, relief, grief, exhaustion swept through the benches. Victims wept. Neighbors clasped hands. You could almost feel decades of oppression lifting from people's shoulders as bailiffs led Valerie away. Her shoulders bent under shackles instead of authority. Marcus Webb, the disgraced attorney, received his sentence a week later. 5 years in federal prison, heavily reduced for cooperation, permanent disbarment, and a lifetime prohibition from legal practice. His career ended where his survival instinct had barely preserved his freedom. But most remarkable was what followed outside the courtroom. Congress introduced the federal HOA Accountability Act, legislation with overwhelming public support across party lines. It created federal oversight of aggressive HOA enforcement, criminalized impersonation of government authority in property disputes, and mandated protections for elderly and disabled homeowners. At the state level, I signed a companion bill requiring free legal aid for families threatened with HOA fraud and mandatory reporting of enforcement anomalies. What had begun as my personal standoff with a bulldozer became a national movement. Pierce's conviction became case law taught in law schools, cited in training materials for state prosecutors, and printed in national headlines as the template for dismantling fraud disguised as neighborhood order. Months later, as environmental crews repaired poisoned watersheds and a memorial garden grew for victims, I stood on my rebuilt deck at sunrise. The chair where my mother once sat still faced the east, where the light always arrived faithfully. Neighbors visited more often now. Farmers who had barely spoken before Pierce's reign shared coffee, seeds, and even laughter. Out of terror, unity had been born again. Valerie's empire of fear had dissolved, but the resilience of ordinary people outlived her crimes. The plaque at the new memorial read, "In memory of homes lost, in honor of resilience found, and as a promise of justice for generations ahead." That was the true sentence, one no judge could ever sign. Her cruelty became the soil where new protections grew. And as the valley breathed in silence finally restored, it was impossible not to feel that in the end, truth had done what it always does. It outlived the lies.